The house I grew up in was magical. It was huge. The original part of the house was built around 1800, give or take, making it over 200 years old. It had been built as the slave quarters for a mansion that was across the street from us. The mansion and slave quarters were originally part of the same property, and there was a carriage path that went between the two of them, but eventually that became the street, so that the house predated the street. It was just a carriage path. And so when the carriage path was made into the street, it divided the property, which meant that what had been just part of the yard became now the street, so that our front yard was basically non-existent. Our house was right up against the street. The walls of the house were what they call lath and plaster, which was a way that they made houses before drywall. It was used between 1700 and the early 1900s. And they would put in these very rough slats and then put this sort of a porridge-like substance in there, and that was the lath and the plaster. So the floors in the oldest part of the house were these amazing hardwood floors. Not like the hardwood floors that you see today, but they were blonde wood that was narrow, and it was really well done. It was amazing. And we had shutters on the windows, like real shutters. Not like anything that you see today. I mean, I guess they make ones that are kind of like that, but these were old wooden shutters. Oh, what else can I tell you about it? The mansion was always owned by some millionaire, some rich guy, a lawyer or a business owner, something like that. Whereas our house had gone through several working class owners over the years, and each time they had done an addition to the house. And so what this did was it gave the house this kind of rambling quality. It was built on a very gradual slope, so the front of the house was close to the road, but then as it went towards the back of the house, it went down this hill. And every time somebody had added onto it over the years, it made the house kind of go down the hill a little more as it went back. And this gave the house a kind of a meandering quality, because it was very expansive. It just kept getting bigger. And it was like the house kind of flowed down the hill like a stream. But what inside the house, what this meant was that there was a small step, sometimes not so small, between every room. And it was easy for visitors to trip just going from room to room, because every room had a step, just about every room. And doorways were often too low, especially on the first floor, just because that's how they made doorways back in 1800. So you had to kind of duck as you went into each room. But again, visitors wouldn't know that, and they would hit their head. So we had to put up a sign in some of these doorways that would say duck. It had a lot in common with old European houses. For example, in a modern house, you have a central hallway, and all the rooms are off the central hallway. Well, our house was like a lot of these very old houses, where you went from one room into the next room. So one room led into the next room, and so you kind of had to know where you were going. It was like almost like a maze or a labyrinth. And there were unexpected twists and turns, and there would be hallways shaped kind of like this, and there would be like hallways where you wouldn't expect them, or there wouldn't be hallways where you would expect them, and there would be rooms that you couldn't find because they were kind of hidden. And there were lots of doors and windows that led nowhere. And this was largely because of all the additions that had been done by different generations of people. So, for example, there would be doors that were blocked off by dressers or cabinets or even counters that were built in with a door behind them, and you couldn't ever use that door. That door was basically gone, but it was still there as a door. One of the things that I remember was that we had a pass-through between the kitchen and the dining room, but that pass-through used to be the back wall of the house, and so that had been the window, but then it became the pass-through. And because the house predated modern plumbing, it hadn't originally had what we would think of as things like a kitchen, a dining room, a laundry room, a shower, like bathrooms, because they didn't have all those things the way we think of them. And so over the years, with all these additions and renovations, people had repurposed existing rooms to make them into those kinds of rooms. For example, both our kitchen and our dining room had carpeted floors, which is a pretty strange thing for a kitchen or a dining room. And the bathrooms hadn't originally been bathrooms, and so the house had no shower. But some previous person had built a shower in one of the additions, and that was probably in the early 20th century. It was a cement shower, had cement walls, and it drained directly into the dirt below the house, because there was no plumbing. There was no, wasn't connected to anything. And they had these water spigots. They were like, little plus-shaped water spigots. Had two of them, one for hot, one for cold. And by the time I lived there with my family, that shower had been discontinued. It had been turned into the main entrance for the house, so that you opened the door and you stepped in, and now you were in that old cement shower. It had been brightly painted, so it was kind of cool. And those handles that had been used, the spigots for the water, were used as a place to hang your coats. We did have a bathtub. It was one of those really old clawfoot bathtubs, but we did not have a traditional shower. Just didn't have one. One of my early childhood memories was when they installed a septic system in the side yard. And I remember that huge hole in the ground. And so when someone would use the toilet in the house, that it went into the septic system. The house was huge. I think I said that, but we had so many rooms. There was a living room, but then there was also a front room, and there was a den, which was the office, And in the den, there was this huge antique roll-top desk. And there was a craft room. My mother was a seamstress, and so she had this craft room, which was her sewing room. And she had several antique sewing machines that she used all the time. And just drawers and drawers of craft supplies, fabric, shelves of fabric, all kinds of things, like anything you could imagine. It was a pretty cool room. There was a music room so that you could learn any instrument. We had a huge, an old player piano, an upright player piano, and a shelf, floor-to-ceiling shelf full of piano rolls. And there were guitars and recorders and several other instruments, some of them kind of obscure, as well as a vast record collection there in the music room. There was a pantry, and this pantry was enormous. It was as big as a modern living room, and it was a hidden room. So that if you were just coming into the house, if you didn't know and you'd never been in the house before, you could not find the pantry. But it was this huge room. It wasn't directly off the kitchen. You kind of had to go in and turn and around a little bit, and it was back in there. But it was floor-to-ceiling shelves of food. Most of the stuff in there was not perishable, obviously, because it wasn't a refrigerated room, but we had a deep freeze in that room. It was, I grew up thinking that's what a pantry was this enormous room. It was like a pantry you'd see in maybe a hospital or a school. It was that big. We had what we called our game room, but it wasn't a room where people played games. It was a room where we stored the games. And so the game room was just, again, floor-to-ceiling shelves that were just board games. And it was big. It was, again, the size of a living room, but it wasn't a room that we used for anything like that. It was just a place where we had all of the games. And we had a ton of games. There was a hall closet that was so long and deep, it was almost like its own hallway, but it was a closet. And in the outside, you would just think, oh, this is a tiny little closet. You open the closet door, but then it just went on and on. It seemed like it went on forever. And then there was the library. Easily as big as the ones you see in movies, where you see some rich person's home and they've got a library. It was like that. It was amazing. And the shelves were full of books on science and history, nature, other cultures. We had tons of classics, literature. That's where we kept our family photo albums. That's where we had lots of important documents, and everything was all in the library. So the library was this vast room that was just amazing. And the library was also set up like a Montessori style, almost like a school, like a Montessori school, where you had different stations. So if you went around the library, under the shelves on the floor, there was like a cubby hole under each shelf, and you could pull out a box, and it had educational materials. So every box had something different, Like one was wooden blocks, and one was Lincoln Logs, one was Tinker Toys, one was Legos, one was comic books. And these would have been, Golden and Silver Age comic books. And this was a place where we would play. My sister and I would go to the library, and my mom had a speaker where she piped in classical music. So we'd have classical music playing, and where children were playing with blocks on the floor of the library. And other than the library, which was a great place to play, there were other playrooms. So there was a playroom for large toys, had a chalkboard. It was a big, wide room, this other playroom. And large toys, things like riding toys and, kitchen, like full-size toys that kids would play with. And so that was had big picture windows. We'd play with our stuffed animals there. And then, so in addition to the library and this big playroom, there was another playroom, which was where we would play with our Fisher-Price houses. And that room had a great big console stereo, and a collection of records. They were the kid records. That's where we kept those. And the Fisher-Price houses were kept in a big closet in that room. And that closet was kind of unusual. Everything in the house was unusual. It wasn't like a closet. It didn't have a door, and the opening to the closet was really wide. And it just had a heavy curtain across it. And the shelves only went up to like an adult's waist. And so we would put all the Fisher-Price houses in this closet. But the closet was so wide and deep that as a child, you couldn't reach the back wall, and you couldn't reach the sides inside the closet. They were just so far away. It made me think of the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was like the closet was going to take you to Narnia, because you couldn't quite reach the back. So just one of the many things about the house that were kind of magical. Now, I've talked about the rooms, but when you came in the house, if you were a stranger, a visitor, you would see from the outside that it was a huge house. And you could see that it had 2 or 3 stories. And you're like, okay, walk around the whole first story, and you'd be like, how do you get to the second story? Because if you didn't know, you would not be able to find any stairs. Because the stairs were hidden in the music room, in a very narrow closet door. You would open the closet door, and then there would be these very narrow, steep stairs going up. And I've been told that these stairs are very similar to the ones they have in Amsterdam. So these Dutch-style stairs, which are very steep and narrow and dangerous. There was no handrail. But at the first part, when you first go in, you'd open this closet door and you'd go in these stairs, and you could put your hands on either side of the wall, either wall. But then when you get to the top, you're just coming up on the second floor. You're just coming up out of the floor. There was nothing to hang on to. So those stairs were often very frightening for people who didn't live there. And then there were stairs again in the library that would lead up to the attic. And the attic went the entire length of the house, from the very, very front of the house through straight back through this expansive, rambling house all the way back. And the attic had this huge cavernous barn-like quality because, of course, it was the walls were largely unfinished and raw, and so that made it seem almost like a barn, and it was just full of all these amazing magical treasures. But we could talk about that later. But it was this huge room, enormous room, vast. And so, because the house was so old and had a kind of a patchwork construction quality to it, the heating in the house was a bit uneven. So the furnace ducts did not reach into every room. Some of the rooms, you just kind of had to use a space heater. And my bedroom, of course, was one of these rooms. I remember very often in the winter, on cold mornings, I would wake up and I would see my breath. And that was normal. We had a garage. We called it our garage, but it wasn't a place where you put a car. It was a separate building, and it was more like what you might call a shed today, but it was an old wooden building from a very long time ago. And it was more where construction materials were stored. A lot of old doors in there and a lot of half-created walls or things like that. And of course, that's where we put all our bicycles. But, cans of paint, things like that. But it was not a place to store a car. The house was like a member of the family. It had such personality. And as a kid, it's like a fun house. It was constantly being updated, renovated, remodeled. Something was always going on. Adding a porch, taking away a porch, putting stairs here. There were always things going on pretty much right up until my parents passed away around 2000. And then the house stayed in the family. And just a few years ago, there was a fire. And that was pretty much it for the house. There is a part 2 to this video where I talk about other aspects like the enormous magical yard that we had and what grew there. But this is the end of this video. So thank you and bye.